Well, hello there. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you are not the average bear. It is time to continue where we left off before the rapture study. We had been discussing a very important sign of the times, the extinction of earth and sea, as was predicted in Revelation 11. In the last two studies before the rapture study, I showed actual proof that the forests of both land and sea are in the throes of mass extinction. In this study, we look at other biblical prophecy to understand why and how this is happening in these end times. In previous presentations, the viewer was shown how Revelation 11:18 reveals that the earth as we know it will be destroyed by the wicked, and that one day they too shall be destroyed for their wickedness and for destroying God's physical creation. Let's read it again together, shall we? The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth. We are now living to witness the death throes of the planet. But why is this being allowed to happen? So let's go back to the very beginning, shall we? In that sweet little garden where the first woman had a fateful conversation with a possessed and very clever serpent, who was actually probably more like a dragon since he hadn't been cursed to slither on his belly as of yet. And as an aside, for those of you who don't think animals can be possessed by unclean spirits, you must have completely forgotten about the time Jesus cast a legion of demons into a herd of pigs. Anyway, back to the conversation. Now, there are bald-faced lies, and then there are subtle lies. Satan, being the father of lies, doesn't generally offer bald-faced lies until it's too late, and a person has already been fully seduced by him. In the case of Eve in the garden, the lies were masterfully told. Eve might have been born yesterday, but she wasn't completely stupid. Innocent, yes, but not without intelligence. She was designed to help keep Adam out of trouble. That might have been why the serpent went after her first. But instead of keeping man out of trouble, well, you know the rest of the story. Anyway, back to that conversation. I'm going to read Genesis 3:1-6. Now, the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, speaking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. Now, did Eve die as soon as she ate from the tree? Not as we think of death, not an immediate death of the body or complete death, but she did die, in the sense that her body was no longer eternal and ageless, and in the sense that her soul had now been cut off from abiding with God. This is the worst kind of death you could die. So the serpent, or Satan, spoke a half-truth to her. She did not die completely the day she ate the fruit, and yet she did die in ways she had yet to fathom. And then Adam too. Why am I going over this with you? We all know this story. Because the day that Adam and Eve ate of the tree, not only did they introduce sin and death to themselves, humanity, their descendants, but also to all physical creation on earth. Sin was a disease that contaminated all physical creation and set it to groaning. The earth and all its creatures also began to age, deteriorate, degenerate, and to die, and also some of them to eat each other and to become venomous. The ground was cursed. That was the beginning of weeds and thorns and thistles. Man had to struggle with the land now. Before, it just grew all of the food that man could ever need. But now man had to toil in the earth in order for it to produce. All of physical creation now needed the cleansing that only God could bring through the blood of a Savior. Let's see what the Bible says pertaining to this. For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. So all of creation is waiting for humanity to become saved, to walk as the sons of God, to have their salvation fulfilled. When that is done for humanity, then all of creation can be healed. Since the garden, and especially since the flood, people have been becoming considerably less intelligent, healthy, tall, and long living. People went from living forever to almost 1,000 years to maybe 120 years, not even that. People used to be much larger, I suspect, and I'm not referring to the Nephilim giants or their descendants, of which the original Nephilim were insanely huge. I'm saying that by today's standards, our first ancestors may have also looked like lowercase g giants. These people in these pictures here are real people, and they don't have giantism. They are normal, large human beings. And trust me, you can find this phenomenon across the ethnic spectrum. It's not just to the Nordic races. I think some of these large people are genetic throwbacks to a more perfect time for human beings. I've always thought our pre-flood ancestors were larger. I was pleased when actually Ron Wyatt found giant bones at the burial site of Noah's family. Think about this. People have the capacity to regrow their teeth, but they don't. Scientists are just starting to understand how to unlock this ancient biological ability in people's bodies. Also, look at Sarah. If you read the stories concerning Sarah, the wife of Abraham, she was gorgeous until she was almost dead. Even when she was too old to bear children, the pharaohs and the kings were still after her. Let's face it, people were aging a lot better back then, too. Now let's think about this. It's not just the people, but the animals and the plants that have changed too. The magnificence and the beauty of the natural world today is but a pale shadow of the pre-flood earth and of the Garden of Eden. I can't find it anymore, but I remember being in Christian high school, and the science teacher showed us a video of this man who was growing giant fish, plants, and turtles inside of his, I don't know, it was like a greenhouse or something. He was growing them, and he was doing this by, he grew them in a condition that was akin to the pre-flood atmosphere, where there was more carbon and more moisture, and I don't remember all the details, but all the plants, the fish, the turtles were huge, ginormous, way bigger than normal. The pre-flood environment was conducive to all of creation's growth. And I can't find this video that my science teacher showed me. I really tried to look for it, and I can't find it anywhere, but I wonder why. Imagine the Bible being true and carbon actually being good for you. All right. So we know that the forests of land and sea are dying. But why would God allow this? Well, we just learned from the Bible that the disease of sin poisoned all the earth and all its creatures, not just humanity. What is also interesting to note is that the amount of sin committed on earth, think about this, it increases with time, population, and technology, and sin is cumulative. It doesn't ever go away. So as time goes on, the earth doesn't have to deal with less sin and disease as people die, but more. The earth isn't catching any kind of a break. In fact, the Bible says the earth is constantly crying out to God from all the sin being committed upon her and all the blood being shed upon her. She hates sin. It defiles her. God allows the earth to die too because of the infection of man's sin. Therefore, the earth will have to one day be purified and remade. So now we know the why of why we're going extinct, or the earth is going extinct. But what about the how? How does the earth undergo destruction and dying? Okay, well, the answer number one, by the direct destroying hand of a vengeful God, or two, by man's misstewardship of the earth and its creatures, or three, through technology. For point one, the direct hand of God. Sometimes the earth is directly destroyed by God because of the curse of sin. Think about it. The land blesses man mightily, and it is where man abides. Thus, the earth often takes a beating because, by proxy, it serves as a punishment to man, who is the progenitor of sin on the earth. So let's think of examples of this. So the flood would be an excellent example of this. The whole earth and all the creatures were totally destroyed because of the sin of man. Or Sodom and Gomorrah, the whole place became dust. I mean, it's a wilderness. The 10 plagues of Egypt. And then point number two, why is this happening, or how is this happening? Actually, number two, where we're misstewarding the earth. Sometimes, or actually quite often, man is a poor steward of the earth, abusing it and its resources and its creatures. And I really don't need to give you any examples of this. We all know this too well. And then there is point number three, technology. High technology enables man to abuse the earth in ways it has never been able to do before. Man's natural capacity for destruction is nothing compared to the unnatural capacity he now has through high technology. What man could do to earth before this technology is nothing compared to what man can do now to earth with this technology. And so technology brings us back to another biblical prophecy. Daniel. We're going to talk about Daniel for a minute. Daniel is one of the very few people in the Bible record that has ever been referred to as the beloved of God. Daniel, being an Israelite in Babylonian exile from his youth till his death, remained ever faithful to God. He prayed 3 times daily without fail and never compromised in worship, even in the face of death. He became a cherished advisor to kings and a prophet and oracle of God. Daniel was one of the very few people in existence to be shown much of what was to come to pass at the end of time, or the end of the age preceding the perfection of Christ's millennial reign. Many secrets were revealed to Daniel by God, one of which described the state of human civilization at the end of the age. Let's read that. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. We see then that in the last days that people would be able to travel freely and easily over great distances, as they had never done before, and that knowledge would be increased. Now, when we say knowledge increased, first of all, we have to remember something about God, about God's statements. God says what he means, and he means what he says. What I mean by that, he doesn't use a lot of flowery descriptives. He doesn't need to. The words God uses are always meant to their fullest definition. So when God says knowledge would increase in the last days, he doesn't mean by a little bit. He means exponential, to an unfathomable degree by the prophet's standard. If this were not true, why would the mighty Creator waste his time mentioning it at all to Daniel, or try to keep the prophecies of it so secret and hidden? Things of no significance have no need to be guarded, hidden, or even understood clearly. Okay, so now we know that in the days preceding Christ's final return, knowledge among mankind will increase to an unfathomable extent, to a degree probably never achieved by humanity before. And I only say probably because we really don't know what the world looked like before the flood. There were some pretty crazy things going on. But I imagine that we will achieve a technology perhaps we've never achieved before. But what kind of knowledge? To be sure, technology will increase, but also something else, something even more important. The Holy Spirit will give greater discernment and understanding to God's people living in the last days, for they will have need of it. For these will be the days of greatest deception, wickedness, torment, suffering, and confusion. Daniel was instructed to seal up the end-time prophecies he had been given until such a time when knowledge had increased. In these last days, God will open up the meaning of the end-time scriptures. That is why it's been held off to the end. In these last days, God will open up the meaning of the end-time scriptures, just as he opened up the messianic scriptures in the days of Jesus' earthly ministry. This is the modus operandi of God. It is his pattern, so to speak. The prophecies are God's signature of power emblazoned through the years. It's something that can't be changed. We can look back and say, hey, he said this long ago. But the full understanding of it, we might understand it in part. But when it actually happens, then we'll say, oh, that is what that means. The servants of God will be given greater understanding and clarity concerning the end-time scriptures for the days of these prophecies' fulfillment. Those seeking God with diligence and purity in these end times will be shown great and secret things. They will also be shown how they must protect themselves from the lies and threats that will be all around them. Understanding is given as needed by man, as willed by God, and as requested by the devout. God says he loves to pour wisdom out on the faithful servant who asks for wisdom. That doesn't always mean we get the answers that we want. But sometimes we do. And some things he forbids from our understanding for good purpose. The exponential increase of technology over the last 120 years is no accident. Humanity is accelerating in a direction that leads to no man's land, a path to total self-destruction via technology. Knowing this, ask yourself where most of this technological inspiration is really coming from. Knowledge and understanding can only come from one of two places in this world, either from God, who has unlimited knowledge, or from Satan, who has limited knowledge. So when people have strokes of genius, these epiphanies are really just products of supernatural encounters, either an encounter with the Holy Spirit or an encounter with an unholy spirit. As a matter of fact, the Romans coined the word genius and defined it as a god, a deity, or a guardian spirit that accompanied a person from their birth, guiding, influencing, molding a person's fate, and revealing secret things. These quote-unquote deities accompanied a person throughout their life and was their connection to the divine. So there you have it. Even ancient Romans understood where genius or intellectual or technological advancement came from. This point is even reaffirmed in the Bible in the story of Paul and an exorcism in Acts 16. There was a little slave girl who had the quote-unquote gift of divination, telling the future. And her gift brought her master a lot of money. This girl went around following Paul and the disciples, though, calling out, "The servants of the Most High God, who proclaim to us the way of salvation." It was a spirit speaking these things from the girl. I don't know if it was a spirit of mockery. I don't know exactly what the spirit was trying to accomplish right there, but it was probably a spirit of mockery. It was a spirit speaking these things from the girl, and it was greatly annoying Paul. So he cast it out of the girl. And lo and behold, the girl could no longer perform as a fortune teller. Her gift of divination, her genius, had been removed. And her master became infuriated, especially with Paul. So, after all, Paul had cast out this girl's very valuable genius. The master got the town in an uproar over this matter, and Paul and the other disciples were almost killed over this incident. The disciples were beaten and thrown in prison over this matter. How humanity loves the knowledge of unclean spirits. How they love genius. Nothing has changed. And it's not to say that you can't have a genius from God and the Holy Spirit. That happens all the time. It's just to say that if you do have a stroke of genius, you should probably ask where it's coming from. Because anything that Satan or his minions ever give you, it's never good for you or for other people. It always has an evil agenda in it. It's not for your good. He only comes to kill and destroy and rob you. So, in that light, okay, it's unfortunate that the understanding and advancement that God reveals to man for the benefit of God's creation is often misused or manipulated for evil purposes as well. That being said, God's gifts are always meant for our good, no matter how evil people may use them. So, Satan's revelations are always meant for mankind's misery and with their destruction in mind. The ancient Jews had no misgivings where evil secrets or dark technology came from. The book of Enoch, which is not only mentioned in the Bible, but is quoted in the Bible, and the book of Jude to be exact, makes it very clear where occult knowledge and understanding came from. According to Enoch, it came from the angels who fell in Genesis chapter 6. The angels left their first estate in heaven to take wives from any of the ladies on the earth that they wished, and they had children by these ladies. The angels taught their women secret things which birthed witchcraft and the occult, and angels taught the men the art of warfare and how to make weapons. In this vein of thought, think about every modern government's military industrial complex and how all our governments are constantly telling us, the average citizen, we need more weapons in order to secure more peace. Isn't that interesting? It's funny how that works. Well, now humanity has quite an arsenal: nuclear, chemical, biological, gravitational, lasers, energy and frequency modulation weapons, and on and on and on and on. Isn't it funny that it was the angels who started to introduce warfare to us? And look at all this military warfare technology we have now. Not to mention the mad scientists now tampering with the genetic fabric of everything natural under the sun, including and especially human beings. It really boggles the mind. Where are all these strokes of genius coming from, I wonder? In order to understand how this technology is destroying the earth, you have to look at the technologies themselves. There is no way I could possibly explain and detangle any of these technologies completely, let alone all of them. So I've broken them up loosely into 3 huge categories. I'm going to go over them. So the first one we're going to look at is nuclear power and weapons and the unending nuclear radiation coming out of this technology. Then we have I don't know what I'm going to do here, but geoengineering, HARP, energy and gravity weapons, lasers, stratospheric meddling, earth frequency manipulation, 5G towers, and the star such and such by Mr. You-Know-Who. Anyways, finally, the bioengineering and transhumanism, chemical warfare. I was going to show this little clip from Dr. Michio Kaku about how nuclear energy and nuclear power is really just a very foolish Faustian gamble. If you want to see that video, it's really good. It's right there. That's the address. But we really need to get on to the nuclear montage. You guys have to see for yourselves how the nuclear technology is causing our world to go extinct. It's one of the biggest factors. And you really need to look at this to understand the heaviness, the weight of the truth of what I'm saying to you. So watch it.
Then there's high-level waste, and this is what everyone thinks about when they hear about nuclear power plants. The alarms start blaring, the hazmat suits go on. High-level nuclear waste is as radioactive as you think, but the good news is there are effective ways to contain it. When a nuclear fuel rod serves its purpose and is taken out of the core, it becomes high-level waste. While the number of high-level waste objects is small compared to the other classes, the level of radioactivity is so high that it accounts for over 95% of total radioactivity caused by nuclear energy. While most radioactive isotopes produced by high-level waste are high-powered but have a short half-life, the presence of isotopes like plutonium makes it critical to ensure it's contained safely. So what's the best way to dispose of nuclear waste? That's what nuclear energy-using countries have been arguing over for decades. Most experts say the best solution for long-term disposal is by constructing a deep underground facility similar to a mine that can contain large amounts of high-level waste away from humans and be sealed up in between disposals. But that's easier said than done, and no country has finished one. Although Finland is close to completing their Onkalo spent nuclear fuel repository on the west coast. Currently, countries use a number of alternative systems that are considered safe but imperfect. The first step to minimize the impact of nuclear waste on the environment is to neutralize it as much as possible. This is done by processing it and stabilizing it into a form that loses its explosive properties. Some countries mix the waste with sugar and then calcinate it into a solid object by processing it through a rotating tube. Turned into glass, the waste products are then bonded to the other molecules and then poured into stainless steel and sealed. They're then stored underground, where the waste products are trapped for thousands of years without leaking radioactivity into the environment. Other technologies include ion exchange, where medium-level wastes are neutralized by concentrating the radioactivity into much smaller volumes. This makes them easier to contain, but isn't recommended with the volatile high-level wastes. But when the time range for nuclear waste to become deactivated can reach into the millennia or longer, with some rare isotopes having a half-life of over 1 million years, scientists are concerned that these storage methods can come back to haunt us. That's why we've eliminated many of the more short-sighted methods of nuclear waste disposal, like ocean disposal. Up until the 1990s, many countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, would dump drums of contained nuclear waste into the ocean, especially in the coastal regions of Somalia. Somalia hasn't had a functioning government since the 1990s, and the pirates weren't going to mess with a large ship bearing a country's flag when they could go after smaller merchant ships. So countries thought anything goes out there. The Arctic Ocean was also a popular choice for the Soviets, as they controlled a huge coast in the north. Overall, 137,000 tons were dumped in the water by European countries in 34 years, and it took its toll on the oceans. Tests of areas where dumping was common found elevated levels of radioactivity, and in 1993, a treaty was passed banning ocean disposal of nuclear waste. The most common current method for nuclear waste disposal is above-ground disposal, where waste is sealed up in a steel cylinder with an inert gas that won't react with it, and then sealed in radiation-shielding concrete. The radiation-proof drums are then sealed in a storage facility near the nuclear power plant. This is how big plants handle their waste in-house, and it's popular for a few reasons. First, it's handled internally and the plant doesn't have to get approval and fight their way through government red tape to find a dumping facility.
The Earth is often the place to bury things you want to hide. Out of sight, out of mind. A burial site for radioactivity is under construction at a place in Finland called Onkalo, which means cavity or pit. When it opens in a few years, it will be the world's first permanent repository for high-level nuclear waste. When a fifth reactor is hooked to the grid later this year, nuclear energy will provide more than 40% of Finland's electricity. It's a carbon-free energy source, but it comes with a pitfall: spent fuel rods of highly enriched uranium. Operators cool the rods off in pools of water and store them in warehouses in interim casks, but they're vulnerable to leaks and accidents while they're above ground. Finland will be the first nation to permanently dispose of spent nuclear fuel. Robots will transfer the rods to giant copper casks, then bury them nearly half a kilometer below the surface. They must remain safe and dry for at least 100,000 years, into the next ice age, until the radioactive elements inside decay to acceptable levels. It's important to keep water from carrying radionuclides back to the surface, a dangerous scenario for ecosystems and human health. So Onkalo relies on a series of barriers to keep the copper casks safe.
I'm in Weldon Spring, near St. Louis, Missouri, USA. In the 1950s and 60s, this strange, grey, wind-blasted hill wasn't here. Instead, there was a uranium processing factory, and conditions for the workers back then were shocking by today's standards. It wasn't quite the 1940s. You can find testimony from back then of workers hand-scooping uranium ore. But there are tales of spilled radioactive powder, of overflowing disposal pits, and of strange-looking frogs, and I am not making that up. When the factory here was running, it was known as the Clean One. And, well, it wasn't. The plant here closed in 1966 as the most contaminated site in the area. PCBs, mercury, asbestos, and radioactive waste. In the 1980s, the Environmental Protection Agency declared Weldon Spring a Superfund site, meaning it would finally be cleaned up. And the result is this: a 7-story high nuclear waste dump, the permanent disposal cell, containing more than 1 million cubic meters of toxic waste and hopefully keeping the local residents safe for the next 1,000 years or so. And that was going to be pretty much all of the video. If you search this place online, that's as far as a lot of articles go. Except Then I did a bit more research, and I found out about Coldwater Creek, a few miles away, where radioactive waste from the Manhattan Project, the project that built the first nuclear bombs, the waste was just dumped there in the 1940s with the government's approval. That waste eventually flowed decades later into people's backyards after flooding. That was in 2015. Then there's the West Lake landfill on the other side of St. Louis, where an underground trash fire has been burning very close to another radioactive waste site for 7 years. Now, the risk is apparently minor. No one is about to find a glowing barrel in their backyard, but radiation hazards are invisible and terrifying. Local residents are concerned about clusters of cancer diagnoses, about infant mortality caused by contaminated groundwater. There are wells for drinking water only a mile away. The State Department of Health investigated, and their results set no one's mind at ease. There are so many confounding factors that the facts are, well, somewhere between confusing and unknown, and people are scared. This site is a legacy of a time when the people in charge didn't know or didn't care about the risks of radioactive contamination. But this isn't a monument to how we fix their mistakes. It's a reminder that we're still fixing them, and that we'll still need to for centuries or millennia to come.
Well, this may look like any ordinary field in France. Let me assure you, it's not. Because buried underground are hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of nuclear waste. Things such as tools and clothing used in the nuclear industry. While it may not be the most radioactive, it does represent the large majority of nuclear waste. Let's take a look. Rows of cylinders in metal and concrete spread out over 15 hectares. And here they will stay, monitored for 300 years, kept from harm's way thanks to a synthetic membrane mixed with layers of sand, bitumen and earth. Together, this waste represents 97% of radioactive material. So what about the other 3%? Well, now, that's known as high-level waste. And now we're getting serious. That's the used fuel that comes from inside the core of the reactor, and it's hazardous, so much so it needs to be isolated for 100,000 years. Did you say 100,000 years? Yep. France relies on nuclear for a massive 75% of its electricity. That's more than any other country. As a result, it produces enough toxic radioactive waste every year to fill 120 double-decker buses, or 2 kilograms for every French person. But it's by no means alone. Today, 30 countries host a total of 449 nuclear reactors. And there's more on the way, with 60 under construction. The amount of waste in the world is multiplying, and that's before things go wrong. Japan is still struggling with an ever-growing pile of radioactive waste in the wake of the 2011 tsunami, including 400 tons of contaminated water every day. Nuclear may be relatively cheap and reliable, but it's not always simple. Whether you're for or against nuclear, everyone seems to agree on one point. This high-level radioactive waste is a real problem, and no one has found an ideal solution for the long term. A little like we're all flying on an aeroplane with no runway to land. Not too long ago, the answer could be found here at the beach. Yes, for 50 years, nuclear waste was simply discarded into the ocean. Anyone for a dip? Eventually, Greenpeace raised an alarm, but not before 100,000 tons of radioactive material was dumped, 80% by the British alone. Only in 1993 was it banned under international treaties. So it seems there's only one viable solution. Bury it, not in the water this time, but deep underground.
Greenpeace activists tried to prevent this, in vain. So what's the story behind all this dangerous radioactive waste in the sea? We have been conducting research for a year now in an attempt to find out what became of the barrels of nuclear waste. We also discovered pipes through which the nuclear waste is pumped into the sea. Even Greenpeace didn't know at that time how bad it was, but the protests were successful. The dumping of nuclear waste was forbidden worldwide in 1993. Greenpeace activists were celebrated as heroes, as in the case here in Vigo, Spain. For more than half a century, barrels of nuclear waste had been dumped into the sea in keeping with the motto at the time: the solution of pollution is dilution.
The fundamental underlying problem was that they assumed that if you dilute the radioactivity with tons and tons of water, it's safe to discharge. If you dump solid radioactive waste and it dissolves in tons and tons and tons of water, then it's safe to dispose of it in that way. And that is being proved wrong time and time and time again.
The first evidence that dangerous, highly toxic waste, which has accumulated over the years, simply doesn't disappear through dilution, was gathered by experts after an exploratory trip in the mid-1980s. Germany sent the research vessel Walter Herwig to the Atlantic dump sites. The disposal points were examined. In so doing, the scientists inadvertently salvaged 9 barrels. The researchers found plutonium in the water, in the seabed, and in the fish. Internal papers from the Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, state increased concentrations of plutonium in the dump sites indicate plutonium leaks from the barrels. So now the toxins have finally arrived in the biosphere. Professor Klaus Gruppen has published textbooks on radiation protection. So what about dilution in seawater to levels that would meet the standards required of drinking water? And is everything really hunky-dory?
If the amount in which it is diluted is infinitely vast, if I discharge it into outer space, then it might be well diluted. But the Earth is a very small celestial body, and the concentration is constantly growing.
Our conclusion: the radioactivity is only spreading out instead of disappearing altogether through dilution. There are no exact details about the location and number of barrels, and there is disagreement as to whether they should be salvaged. The dumping of nuclear waste in the sea was banned worldwide in 1993, yet the nuclear industry has come up with other ways. They no longer dump the barrels at sea. They built kilometers of underwater pipes through which the radioactive effluent now flows freely into the sea. One of these pipes is situated in Normandy. It comes from the French reprocessing plant at La Hague. Greenpeace protested here too, underwater. To environmentalists, the matter is clear-cut. This method of disposal through pipes destroys the environment, just like the dumping of barrels. The advantage for the nuclear industry: no more bad press because of the barrels. For the disposal via waste pipes remains hidden from the public eye, quite literally. LAG is the waste processing plant servicing nuclear waste from all over Europe. Germany's casters rolling into Normandy. But the people here are no longer willing to accept the abuse of the sea as a nuclear dustbin. The toxic waste from the reprocessing plant at La Hague is no longer a just local problem for the people of Normandy. According to Boyer, marine pollution is a European problem.
If you balance the benefit against the detriment, this benefit is almost zero, except for the local economy. But as a global point of view, it's zero. And the detriment is evident, so of course it is a sin.
Boyer travels with us to Ostend, Belgium, 400 kilometers from La Hague. He will show us how far the radioactive toxins have already spread, for their origin has been precisely measured. He meets up with a Belgian activist. He gathers seaweed. The environmental activists distrust the measurements made by the operators. Boyer travels with us to Holland. He wants to collect seaweed samples for his lab here as well.
I have the iodine, the seaweeds from Germany there. We collect, this was sent to Accra by a German friend of us who was worrying, is there iodine contamination from La Hague up to Germany? And the answer is yes. We find iodine in the seaweed up to Germany.
We are back in Accro's labs, the Citizens Initiative. The water that was just brought here by volunteers has given a 5-fold higher tritium value than the rating supplied by the French operator Arriva. It is now obvious why the citizens take their own measurements. David Boyer has brought some marine animals from the market. Pierre Babet, a molecular biologist, tells us what happened to the animals.
We now know that there is a very good exchange between the deep sea and the upper water layers. The radioactive toxins accumulate in the food chain. This little worm here, for example, can contain 2,000 to 3,000 times more radioactivity than its environment. It is then eaten by the next biggest creature and so on. At the end of the food chain, we discovered damage to the reproductive cells of crabs. And this damage, these genetic defects, are inherited from one generation to the next.
And the effects and the mechanism of human cells and animal cells are the same?
Yes, yes. I don't know, a cell in human or in animal, it's the same.
Highly toxic plutonium is found in gray seals off the coasts of Europe. Radioactive cesium has been found in porpoises. The animal impact upon future generations is unknown, so marine biologists insist every animal must be protected from radioactivity. But how dangerous is the nuclear waste in the sea for us humans? We look for answers to this question in the UK, in Sellafield. There have been some alarming reports from there. The second disposal pipe for Europe's nuclear waste is located in the north of England. As in France, it was Greenpeace environmental activists who drew attention to the pipe. That was in 1997. Also present, the then 35-year-old Sean Burney.
And the electricity.
For nearly 2 decades, Bernie has been actively campaigning against the discharges. It is a struggle for numbers, limits, but also the prerogative of interpretation. Bernie is concerned about the people here on the coast. The government has had many of them examined.
You see here, along this coast, there are people living on this beach. You can see these small houses, and they are what's considered one of the critical groups because they live right on the beach. They're exposed every day to the sea and therefore to radiation coming in from the sea. So their houses are full of plutonium dust. Their bodies will be more radioactive. They'll have plutonium in their teeth. The closer you are to Sellafield in the UK, the more plutonium you have in your teeth.
The pipe from Sellafield is clearly visible only from the air. But how could the disposal contractor bypass the ban on discharges? Nuclear waste is still being dumped in the sea. The operators argue this is land-based disposal and therefore legal. It has been approved by the authorities.
Is there a scientific, logical reason why barrels are prohibited and discharges are allowed?
I think it is more a philosophical question.
This is not a philosophical question for him. Wolfgang Renneberg was Director for Nuclear Safety at the German Federal Ministry of the Environment and is an expert in the disposal of radioactive waste.
No, there is no logical reason for it. Ultimately, there are only economic reasons. The question is, how expensive would it be to install appropriate filtration systems, for example, that would ensure that a discharge of this kind is close to zero? Perhaps this plant would prove to be uneconomical. That's what's behind it. There's no evidence of a physical reason or any other reasons for that matter.
Every day, more radioactive swill flows into the Irish Sea. Nuclear waste from Sellafield can now be found on the Norwegian coast. In the meantime, the local residents are given to believe all is under control here on the beaches around Sellafield. The staff at Sellafield make their presence felt. The operators and authorities both claim there is no risk. Checks and controls are being carried out all the time. And yet, plutonium can be found here on a daily basis. The toxic waste returns from the sea here as well. It leaches out, it dries, and is left lying on the beach. The people here have long since guessed that the dangers are greater than those responsible care to admit.
We're not going to change the world. Little people don't do it. It's the big people that do that. I've never heard any frightening tales. It could be kept quiet. It could be under the carpet. It might not be. But until I know, the sea's being polluted all over the world.
The beach at Sellafield has won an award for being one of the cleanest in England. Every day, a groundhog or a small excavator removes plutonium from the beach. A scanner locates small radioactive particles at a depth of 30 centimeters. In recent decades, the operator at Sellafield has tossed more than 500 kilograms of plutonium into the sea. Sellafield and La Hague show that the disposal of waste into the sea was, and still is, a mistake. However, hardly anyone is prepared to admit it officially, because then you would have to deal with tough questions. Who was lying? What can still be salvaged? And who is going to pay for it? From the northeast Atlantic dump sites all the way up to the coast of Norway, nuclear contamination from barrels and pipes is a problem which is deliberately being brushed under the carpet. This can only be resolved by sealing off the pipes and salvaging the undamaged barrels wherever possible.
Greenpeace is the largest anti-nuclear organization. They shot the images of the damaged radioactive barrels on the sea bottom. This NGO opened its doors to show us its treasure. its video archives.
And we went to a place called La Force de Remarche, or in English, Herd Deep. It's just off of La Hague, between La Hague and the Channel Islands, very near to fishing grounds, very near to popular beaches.
So what did you find there, down in the sea?
Rusted radioactive waste barrels, broken radioactive waste barrels, empty radioactive waste barrels. We can see marine life, eels, fish, taking up residence in the radioactive waste barrel. So then your question is, where's the radioactive waste? The radioactive waste is in the environment. So you can see what happens. It doesn't fall into the dark, black, dead sea. It becomes part of the damn food chain. It becomes subject to pathways that could bring it back to human beings, could bring it back to your dinner plate.
Was that a common practice for nuclear industry at that time?
Everybody did it. The British, the French, the Americans, the Russians. This was a time where there was no regard. The sea was seen as the world's biggest dustbin.
In less than 50 years, countries using nuclear energy have buried over 100,000 metric tons of waste in various oceans. The British alone have dumped 80% of the total amount. Switzerland, with no coastline of its own, is in second position.
The impact of these images, the issue, the story, the drama went worldwide. It took another 10 years before we really effectively won that campaign and ended the dumping of radioactive waste in the sea from ships.
In 1993, a United Nations treaty finally forbade all submersion of nuclear waste. This ban is a victory for the protection of the environment, but it does not solve the problem of radioactive waste. At La Hague, France also has its own installation. A plant that reprocesses waste similar to the one in Mayak.
Donc là, en fait, on se trouve juste dans l'alignement de la sortie du tuyau de rejet radioactif, donc qui vient de l'usine Kojima de La Hague. Donc juste derrière moi, il y a l'usine Kojima, et puis ce tuyau, il part en mer, 4,5 km de conduite, et il se rejette à 1700 mètres de l'extrémité de la pointe de La Hague. Ici, en dessous, là, on a l'équivalent de 33 millions de fûts de 200 litres de déchets nucléaires qui, tous les ans, passent ici à travers donc ce tuyau et sont rejetés en mer. Si ces produits étaient conditionnés dans des fûts, depuis 1993, il serait formellement interdit de les rejeter.
The reprocessing plant in La Hague rejects daily 400 cubic meters of radioactive waste into the currents of the English Channel. Certain elements, such as iodine-129, can be detected as far as the Arctic. The analysis carried out by Greenpeace show that certain ocean bottoms have become true radioactive waste dumps. The seaweed, shellfish, and mollusks are also contaminated.
Suite à l'investigation considérable qu'on avait fait sur le tuyau et tout ce qu'on avait pu démontrer, on a eu l'idée de se dire, mais après tout, il y a aussi un autre émissaire qui pose problème, c'est les rejets gazeux. Donc là, on a dit, mais comment on pourrait faire? Alors on s'est dit, la meilleure solution pour se mettre à hauteur des cheminées, c'est d'utiliser des cerfs-volants. Donc on a pris de très très grands cerfs-volants, sur lesquels on a monté le long du câble un petit tuyau, et puis on a pompé l'air, on a pompé le gaz, à la hauteur des cheminées, à l'extérieur de l'établissement, et regardez ce qu'il y a dans le panache. Et c'est là où on a trouvé des seuils extrêmement importants, de dizaines de milliers de becquerels par litre d'air, de tous les produits radioactifs rejetés par l'établissement de La Hague. Finalement, ça n'avait jamais été mesuré, on était les premiers. Suite à ces mesures de krypton qu'on a fait dans l'environnement, on s'est dit quand même, ça serait bien de regarder un petit peu ce qui se passe concrètement. Et donc on a utilisé pour ça un logiciel américain, qui est celui qu'utilise Kojima, pour regarder la dispersion de ce krypton 85. Et alors là, on a pris la source de krypton, qui part de cette cheminée, et on a regardé comment ça se disperse sur l'Europe. Et on s'aperçoit qu'en 2-3 jours, suivant la direction des vents, l'ensemble de l'Europe est concerné par ces rejets. On a fait des expériences où on peut mesurer, on peut fixer facilement le calendrier de cisaillage des combustibles de Kojima La Hague sur le toit de l'université de Gand en Belgique ou sur le toit de l'université de Genève. Il faut voir que, en fait, ces rejets de La Hague, on est quasiment dans la situation d'un accident permanent. C'est comme si on avait un problème sur une centrale nucléaire et que finalement, on avait un rejet permanent. On est en situation accidentelle permanente, mais légale.
We bring you the world's top 10 worst nuclear disasters in history that shook humanity. Number 10, Kustum disaster. In the race with the USA for developing the atomic bomb and other nuclear weapons, the then Soviet Union constructed an unmapped Mayak plutonium processing plant near the city of Ozyorsk. The waste from the plant was dumped in the nearby lake, which caused immense environmental damage. Then a day came when the temperature in one of the tanks rose to unmanageable levels and broke with a force of 70 to 100 tons of dynamite. This disaster took a heavy toll on life, which spread radiation-induced cancer in surrounding areas. People are still suffering from its side effects to this day. Number 9, 3 Mile Island, 1979. This nuclear incident attracted the world's attention, and the accident occurred due to mechanical failure. This failure was a result of the nuclear reactor's coolant leak. Due to this leak, a significant amount of iodine and radioactive gases were released into the environment. Though the exact amount is not known, the extent of the damage caused was severe, and children along with pregnant women were evacuated within a 5-mile radius. The investigation that ensued showed that the accident occurred due to valve malfunction and human miscalculation. The cleanup process lasted for 4 years. This devastating accident raised questions on harnessing the nuclear energy in the first place. Number 8, Santa Susana Field Laboratory, 1959. This laboratory was in operation from 1949 to 2006. The lab was mainly used to research government-sponsored liquid materials to develop liquid propellant rocket engines for NASA. In the late 1950s, the U.S. experienced one of the worst nuclear accidents in its history, as one of the reactors started releasing enormous amounts of radioactivity, which is believed to be 458 times higher than the 3 Mile Island incident. This contamination from accidents was responsible for cancer-induced death. Number 7, McGuire Air Force Base, 1960. Located in New Jersey, the base is still in operation despite its rumors of leaks. It was the year 1960 when a helium tank exploded and caught fire in a nuclear missile silo. The authorities concluded that the leak was restricted to the base, but after 2 decades, experts argued that at least 7 acres of the area had been contaminated where toxic gases were spread across the land. Number 6, Sellafield. It is a decommissioning and deprocessing site in England. From 1950 to 2001, 21 accidents of leaks have been reported from the site. As a consequence, the nearby areas are highly contaminated, and the population living there is suffering from rare cancer and thyroid cancer. In 1957, a fire broke out which spread to UK and across the mainland Europe. It scattered around a dangerous isotope, iodine-131, which is easily absorbed by the human body and stored in the thyroid, causing a deadly cancer to the population. Number 5, Semipalatinsk Test Site, the Polygon. The testing site was located in Kazakhstan and was used by the Soviet Union to test their nuclear weapons. In the 40-year period, the USSR carried out over 450 nuclear tests, exposing the environment to the harmful radioactive material. An estimate shows that nearly 200,000 to 1.5 million were affected, where children were born with birth defects and the cancer rates increased dramatically. Sometimes, nature takes revenge in ways unknown. Number 4, Serbian Chemical Combine. This plan was crucial for the development of the then Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program. It produced highly enriched uranium and plutonium, which were used to create nuclear warheads. A series of accidents at the facility exposed the nearby people to radioactivity, particularly after the Tosk-7 explosion in 1993. Water, soil, and air remained contaminated, and snow samples showed high levels of radioactive isotopes, which became the reason behind unusual levels of cancer rates and other diseases. Number 3. Chernobyl.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died. The Soviets may have been fairly quick to acknowledge the accident because evidence in the form of mild nuclear radiation had already reached beyond the Soviet borders to Scandinavia. We begin with ABC's Dean Reynolds.
The first word that something was seriously wrong came from this power plant in eastern Sweden, where workers coming on the job registered abnormally high levels of radiation on their bodies. Although the levels were not high enough to harm humans and no accident had occurred at that plant, it was shut down. And as tests were conducted, similar puzzling reports of high radiation came in from all over Scandinavia. But still, no accidents were reported, leading to the conclusion that the problem was elsewhere, to the east, in the Soviet Union, a fact confirmed to the Soviet people on television tonight.
An official announcement from the Council of Ministers. There has been an accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station. One of the atomic reactors was damaged. The consequences of the accident are being taken care of. Help is being given to the victims of the accident. A government commission has been set up.
The civilian plant in question is in the Ukraine. It's something of a showcase facility, featured here in Soviet Life magazine, which extolled its safety record. It's near the city of Kiev, population 2.5 million, and about 1,000 miles from Scandinavia, meaning that whatever did occur there, a radioactive cloud headed north across Poland today and into Denmark, where radiation levels were 5 times normal, to Finland, 6 times normal, to Norway, up 50%, and Sweden, illegally high.
It's almost certainly the most severe accident that has ever taken place in the short history of civilian nuclear power.
That means it is far worse than the 3 Mile Island incident of 1979. Experts tonight say the cloud of radiation is now dissipating over the North Atlantic and poses no further threat to anyone. But as the Soviets treat an unknown number of casualties, there's no way to say how much lasting damage that cloud may have already caused. Dean Reynolds, ABC News, London.
This is Roger Peterson. Until the accident, there were 50 nuclear reactors operating in the Soviet Union, generating 11% of that nation's electricity. Most of the larger Soviet plants differ in design from U.S. reactors. The major difference is most Soviet nuclear plants do not have containment buildings, the thick concrete dome structures Americans are used to seeing built around U.S. reactors. When the worst American nuclear accident occurred at 3 Mile Island, most leaking radiation was kept inside the containment building, unlike this Soviet accident, where radiation has been measured 600 to 1,000 miles away.
The TMI accident was nothing compared with this. I would speculate that it was very serious, and the reason for that is that they've observed radiation levels 10 times normal from Finland all the way down to Stockholm.
Mackenzie says the type of radioactive material spotted could only come from the core, meaning the accident was a meltdown or something comparable. At 3 Mile Island, there was a partial meltdown. The loss of cooling water led to fuel getting so hot it melted, but the core was contained by that thick concrete containment building. In the Soviet accident, there would be nothing to stop a meltdown. The hot core could have melted right into the earth. There are indications the accident could have happened several days ago. It would take that long for radiation to drift to Scandinavia and to make the political decision to announce it.
You can be sure that the decision to disclose was made at the very highest level, undoubtedly by Gorbachev himself, and probably it took several days for the Soviet leaders to decide how to handle it.
Officially, little comment from the president or his aides.
As far as the United States is concerned, we don't see any dangerous situation.
The Soviets claim this is their first nuclear accident, but it's known in 1958 a nuclear explosion killed several hundred and left a large area contaminated some 800 miles east of Moscow. Washington sources speculate the accident at Chernobyl had to be very bad, or else the Soviets would never have acknowledged it. Roger Peterson, ABC News, Washington.
Number 3. Chernobyl. Probably one of the most widely known and publicized nuclear disasters was Chernobyl. In 1986, an explosion at the Ukraine's power plant emitted radioactive particles into the atmosphere, and it started spreading to Western Europe. Surprisingly, only 31 people died from the blast, but the country suffered heavily. The damage done by the explosion is 4 times higher than the atomic bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. The Chernobyl disaster received so much exposure due to the surrounding settlement created around the power plant with new homes, stores, hospitals, and even an amusement park. All brand new. This disaster caused the entire population to pick up immediately, leave everything behind, and resettle, making the area today appear like a creepy ghost town where people simply disappeared. Number 2. Church Rock Uranium Mill, 1979. The state of New Mexico experienced one of the worst man-made accidents of all time. The poor construction of the dam at Church Rock burst in the wee hours of July, sending about 1,100 tons of radioactive waste and 90 million gallons of contaminated liquid along the river. People living in the nearby areas were not aware of the incident and consumed water for irrigation, livestock, and other purposes. The isotope material drastically affected the Navajo community, but the repeated appeals were put on deaf ears. In 2008, the U.S. government started with a cleanup effort. Number 1. Fukushima, 2011. By far, the number 1 worst nuclear disaster was one in recent years, combining a series of natural and man-made devastations. In Japan, 2011, a massive earthquake was followed by an enormous tsunami that triggered a disaster at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. The natural havoc led to power outages and equipment failure, which resulted in 3 nuclear meltdowns. As a consequence, they started to release radioactive material, and around 80% of this material flowed into the ocean, causing havoc to the aquatic, floral, and faunal life. Several thousand people died due to this combination of disasters, and others were relocated to a safer place. Although the long-term effects are yet to be seen, thyroid and other cancers are anticipated based on studies by specialists.
We want to get more on this from our expert, Dr. Michio Kaku, now the physicist at the City University of New York. We've been talking all through this crisis. And I want to put up a map, Dr. Kaku, of what's happening right now at the reactors and get you to sum it up. We've got reactor number 4 where that spent fuel went on fire again overnight. They're going to try to use a water cannon to put that out. We saw reactor 3. There's still a meltdown going on there. They had to turn the helicopter back from that reactor. We know that at reactor 2 there was the compromise of the containment facility, and reactor 1, there's a concern it may be happening there now as well. So you said the situation was dire yesterday, and it seems to have gotten even worse.
It's gotten worse. We're talking about workers coming into the reactor perhaps as a suicide mission, and we may have to abandon ship. Once you abandon ship, it is inevitable that you will have meltdowns in all 3 of the reactors, units 1, 2, and 3. And then the final stage of a meltdown is called breach of containment. We have cracks now, cracks in the containment vessel of units 1, 2, and 3. And if those cracks grow or there's an explosion, we're talking a full-blown Chernobyl, something even beyond Chernobyl.
Something beyond Chernobyl, even though these reactors aren't active in the way that Chernobyl was when it exploded?
That's right, because of the fission products that are stored in the reactor. We have to realize that there are tons, hundreds of tons of nuclear waste still stored in these cores that could then be lofted into the environment. The French physicists analyzed it and said it should be an accident level 6 out of 7. Chernobyl being 7, this being 6, and 3 Mile Island being 5. So we're very close now to the point of no return. We're not there yet. And that's why I think the last ace in the hole is the Japanese Air Force. The military at some point may have to take over. We may have to bury these reactors in concrete, just like we did at Chernobyl, sandbagging the reactor with 5,000 tons of concrete, boric acid, and sand.
So is that the best case scenario at this point?
Well, the best case scenario is there is no massive uncontrolled release of fission products because the containment vessels hold. If we have a total meltdown at all 3 reactors and the vessels hold, then we're in a stable situation. We're hanging by our fingernails, but it's stable. That's the best case scenario. But we now have cracks in all 3 containment vessels, and so it's not certain how stable those vessels are.
The tsunami wave arrived less than an hour after the earthquake. The waves went over the seawall, flooding the lower parts of buildings and disabled the emergency diesel generators. On reactor 1, the operator was unable to reactivate the heat exchanger. The core was no longer cooled. It would be the first to melt. On units 2 and 3, the batteries were still operational. They operated some of the valves. The turbine-driven pumps ran for nearly 24 hours and then stopped. The cores were no longer cooled. The meltdown scenario is almost the same in all 3 reactors, only the dates change. The water in the reactor vessel evaporated. The fuel became uncovered. Heated up to a temperature of 2,300 degrees Celsius, the fuel melted and mixed with the materials from the structure to form a magma called corium. The corium flowed down to the bottom of the reactor vessel. According to Japanese officials, it pierced the reactor vessel before falling on the concrete basemat inside the containment. What quantity of corium fell? How deep did it erode the concrete? Did it pierce the steel liner? Even today, it is not possible to learn more about the state of the corium in the 3 reactors. At the same time, still in the reactor vessel, the steam was loaded with radioactive elements and hydrogen. To explain this phenomenon, let's have a look at the early stages of fuel degradation. Heated at high temperature, the fuel cladding is oxidized and cracks, releasing volatile radioactive elements. In addition to this, the zirconium of the fuel clad created a reaction with the steam by absorbing the oxygen and by releasing hydrogen. Normally, when mixed with air, hydrogen catches fire and explodes. However, the containment building was filled with nitrogen, an inert gas that avoids the presence of oxygen. At this stage, there was no risk. As the steam pressure rose to a dangerous level in the reactor vessel, the depressurizing valves opened. Gas was forced into the wet well suppression pool by a venting line. The water acted as an efficient filter by trapping much of the radioactive elements. But the water was no longer cooled because the emergency diesel generators were out of order, and it soon began to boil, thereby reducing its filtration capacity. The wet well suppression pool and the communicating containment began to enter into an overpressure situation. To avoid containment rupture, the operator decided to release the gas into the atmosphere. Normally, the venting line should have led all the gas outside the building by the chimney of the plant. But hydrogen was escaping through uncontrolled leakage pathways and was released into the reactor building. Hydrogen reacts violently with oxygen in the air. The explosion blew apart the frame at the top of the building, apparently without damaging the containment building. Radioactive elements not yet trapped in the wet well suppression pool were released into the environment. Due to the absence of usable fresh water on the site, the operators decided to inject seawater into the reactor vessel. This solution, far from ideal, since salt is chemically active, had at least the advantage of cooling and stabilizing the corium. In the 4 days following the tsunami, the 4 reactors were damaged by explosions, and 3 of them with core melt. Although it has kept its structure intact, Reactor 2 is the current source of the most important radioactive releases into the soil as well as into the sea. The explosion took place inside the building. Operators have probably encountered difficulties depressurizing the containment, and the wet well suppression pool broke. This loss of leak tightness led to the discharge into the atmosphere of unfiltered radioactive elements and to the spreading of highly contaminated water in the buildings, leading to highly polluting discharges into the sea.
3 years after the meltdown, water is one of the biggest challenges for the Tokyo Electric Power Company. It needs to flush huge amounts of water over the 3 damaged reactors to keep them cool, but doing this makes the water radioactive, and it's been mixing with groundwater and seeping out of the facility into the sea. That's why TEPCO started the construction of a 1.4-kilometre containment wall around the contaminated site. It's driving more than 1,500 pipes into the ground around and beneath the reactors. These will then be filled with coolant, cold enough to freeze the surrounding earth and water into a wall of ice. TEPCO has already tested the technique at the site, but ran into trouble when it failed to cool the earth enough for it to freeze. This time it says it's working better.
The ice wall itself has been tested, and in those cases we've seen that the ground itself does freeze. So I myself am not that worried that it will not go well.
The ice wall technique is sometimes used in tunnelling projects near watercourses, but this is the first time it's being tried on this scale.
They're saying to this generation, look, let's put in an ice wall to divert the water flow around these reactor cores. Those melted down reactor cores will remain active for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So there's a commitment to keep either the ice wall technology in place or to replace it with an alternate technology by some future generation.
Challenging as it is, stopping the spread of radioactive water may prove to be the easy part. Dealing with the melted reactor cores is likely to be much more dangerous and difficult. Tarek Basley, Al Jazeera.
Let's begin with where things are. You still think this is a dangerous and unstable situation?
This is a ticking time bomb. It's stable, but only until we have another earthquake or another pipe break. At that point, water levels could drop, exposing the core, and the accident starts up all over again. The nightmare is not over yet.
But what does it mean that when they went in recently, they found water was lower than they'd expected, possibly meaning that the rods in Reactor 1 had been exposed? What does that mean in terms of radiation leakage and how close we were to a meltdown?
The problem is that we have firemen and brave workers putting water on top of the cores, but the cores are not filling up. There's a leak someplace. Water is actually spilling out, meaning that there's damage to the containment structure. And if water keeps coming out, it means more contaminated water that's building up. Thousands of tons of water being stored in tanks. Some of that, as you know, was released into the ocean, causing an international scandal and incidents with Korea and China.
Do we know what the parameters are? How far has that water gone? Is it going into tanks or is it contained in some way?
So far, it's contained. They brought in extra tanks, and they had to, of course, bleed some of the radioactive water into the ocean to make room for more water. So think of it. Every time they put water in, it's coming out. There's a leak, which means damage to the containment may be more severe than originally thought.
And how about the rods themselves? The fact that the rods have been exposed, does that mean that they are hotter than they would have been since the water is not absorbing heat or energy?
That's right. The tops of the reactors apparently are permanently uncovered. So we're not talking about water being many, many feet above the core. We're talking about water level dropping actually below the top of the cores themselves, causing damage. And that's dangerous because we don't know the amount of melting that has taken place. A huge question mark. There are debates among physicists exactly how much melting has taken place.
Now, one of the things I saw, they're going to put polyester tents over the reactor. Now, look, I've heard there are polyester suits, polyester in toys. Does polyester stop radiation?
It does not. Gamma rays will go right through radiation suits, right through plastic. All it does, it keeps some of the particulates in. So we're building this gigantic tent, hoping that some of the cesium, iodine particles don't escape, because that gets into the food chain. And then we have the problems with milk, the problems with sushi being contaminated. And so that's why they hope to contain the particulates and the dust from getting into the environment.
Now, one of the things that has been notable, the Japanese leadership has not been forthright with the public. It has not been transparent in any way, shape, or form. And you have accused them of not being honest about what they're telling the public. Have they gotten better over the course of this crisis?
I don't think so. The bottom line is they're trying to protect their investments and, you know, to try to salvage the reactor. Those reactors cannot be salvaged. They're pieces of junk right now. So the workers, I have the ultimate respect for the workers. But the managers, their incompetence, they've lost, the people have lost faith in them. You get this mental image of Homer Simpson operating a nuclear power plant.
Does the public there have any confidence remaining in the government?
It's dropping like a rock. People are saying that first they're going to evacuate us, then they're going to take us back, they're going to evacuate, it goes back and forth. And the government and the utility are even fighting. And so we have this situation where there's no united front, people are losing faith, and people are saying, who's in charge here? I mean, who really knows what's happening? In fact, American engineers have contradicted the statements of the Japanese government, making the Japanese government look like foolish.
And how long will it be until the people who live in the area surrounding these plants will be able to go back and live in those houses?
Well, at Chernobyl, there's a dead zone that 25 years later is still off limits. The reactor will take about 30 years to clean up. Hitachi Corporation.
30 years.
30 years. That's the estimate of the Hitachi Corporation. The major estimate is 30 years to clean up that operation. 3 Mile Island took 14 years, and there was no breach of containment at 3 Mile Island. It was only 1 unit. Here we have 3 reactors, 1 spent fuel pond, possible breach of containment. 30 years is about accurate.
Wow. Wow.
To Japan now, where over 1 million tons of wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear power plant has begun to be released into the Pacific Ocean. The decision to discharge water used to cool damaged reactors was approved by the United Nations nuclear watchdog last month. The move has sparked protests and criticism by Japan's neighbours, with Hong Kong's leader John Lee instructing his government to restrict some Japanese seafood imports in response. Japan maintains that the process is safe, saying it will have removed most radioactive elements from the water before it is released. Live now to our Tokyo correspondent Shaima Khalil, who is in Fukushima. Shaima, welcome to you. A significant day for the area, for the country indeed. Just explain why they've made this decision to do this now.
It is a big day here in Japan. There has been a controversial 2-year build-up for those plans and this decision, and today is the day it happens. As we speak, treated radioactive wastewater is being released into the ocean. Now, we're not very far from the nuclear power plant. We can just about make out the chimneys over there beyond the greenery. They've been releasing live pictures of the water being discharged. Now, you can't really see it from where we are because it's all happening underwater. The wastewater is being pumped into a tunnel under the sea. It's about 1 kilometer long and then being released into the ocean. This is a significant day because it is the start of the process, but it is a very long process that's going to span many decades. They're predicting 30 years, maybe longer. Within the first 2 weeks, so from now until 2 weeks, they're predicting that they're going to release about nearly 8,000 tons of this wastewater. Now, it has caused a great deal of anxiety from the moment it was announced, and of course on a day like today. The science says it's safe, the government says it's safe, TEPCO, the company running the plant, says it's safe. Essentially, they've been processing this water, diluting it, removing more than 60 radionuclides. One remains, which is tritium. It's very hard to remove from water, but they say with the dilution, the fact that it's in the ocean, the concentration levels are going to be well below safety standards. That does very little to reassure people here in Fukushima, in Japan, and around the region. It's interesting, we're not very far from a fishing port, and the one fisherman that we wanted to speak to said, look, we've been told not to speak about anything today, but we've been here many, many times, and those who we've managed to speak to are really worried. They say we've suffered a great deal of reputational damage, perception of Fukushima fish, and it's taken us years to convince people to have our seafood. This release is like a second disaster to us. Many people are worried about what to feed their children. And of course, it's not just here in Japan. China is angry. It's criticized Japan for using the Pacific Ocean as its personal sewer. South Korea, even though they've supported this plan, it goes against the public sentiment. People there are very angry, and Hong Kong has issued a ban on Japanese seafood. This is going to take a long time, and it's going to take Japan a lot of work to convince its people and its neighbor that this is safe. And so far, not many are convinced.
According to the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, there are over 400 nuclear power plants in 30 countries currently operating worldwide. The United States is the largest producer of nuclear power, with 99 active facilities, followed by France, Japan, China, and Russia. Most of these plants have operated for years with few problems, so much so that the industry's watchdog doesn't maintain a complete database of prior nuclear mishaps.
The US government is especially callous in Nevada, where nuclear tests are conducted.
We must take risks. Calculated risk, it is true, but risk nevertheless.
The greatest risk factor during nuclear testing is the weather. Wind can be treacherous. If it blows in the wrong direction, radiation hits one's own troops. After the explosion, the radioactive cloud drifts across the countryside. During one of the desert tests, radioactive smoke blows into Snow Canyon National Park. There, it contaminates the sand. Only 1 year later, the shoot of a monumental costume drama begins. In The Conqueror, John Wayne plays Genghis Khan. Hundreds of Native American extras of the Paiute tribe play the Mongolian hordes. During the riding stunts, contaminated sand is kicked up. One of the last Paiute extras from The Conqueror still alive is Bud Myers.
Certain days they had, like the riding past the cameras and things like that. And then they showed a battle scene, you know, you had with a sword and the dust churned up pretty. The horses, they can kick up a lot of dust. Even two horses, you know, near about 40, 50 of them. It's a big old, like a big old windstorm coming through after it's over.
In 1980, a reporter investigates the fate of the Conqueror's cast and crew. Of 220 people, 91 developed cancer, of whom 46 died, including John Wayne, Susan Hayward, the leading actress, and director Dick Powell. This statistic does not include the Paiute extras.
Many of them died of cancer. I had my father, he was out here, he was riding a horse too. He died of cancer. I had two brothers died of cancer, and a younger sister died of cancer. But many of the guys I know that are my age who works here, they're all gone.
Bud Myers meets Claudia Peterson, who grew up near the test sites. She witnessed the nuclear tests of the 50s and 60s as a child. Her fate resembles his.
The reservation down here in Nevada, you know, it's almost straight across from close, you know, to the test site by air miles, you know, you just right over there. And you wouldn't see especially when they tested at night, it just light up the whole area like brighter than the sun.
Well, here in St. George, a lot of the people, when they announced a test, they would, if it was an early morning test or an evening test, they would go up to the highest bluffs with a picnic with their families, and they would all sit out there. It was an event that it was like going to the fireworks on the 4th of July. They would all take picnics and their children and go up there and wait and watch the tests come. And they let them do that. They knew they were doing that. The part that was so hard about it was that our own government, considered us a low-use segment of the population. We were expendable. We didn't matter. That's the hardest part for me to swallow. Being on a farm, our neighbors were sheep herders, and I remember at lambing season, every spring, just piles of deformed, two-headed just deformed baby lambs, dead piles, and I thought that was normal. I remember thinking it's so sad that so many baby lambs die.
The truth was, not only animals are affected.
We were in a small community in Cedar. There were probably 30, 40 kids my age in our class. Darwin Hoyt died of leukemia, and then a year later, one of our classmates got bone cancer, and they had to amputate his leg, and he died like a year later. I remember going to those funerals as a child, thinking, how do children die like this?
Studies proved an increase in some forms of cancer in communities close to the nuclear test sites. The effects of radiation are also felt in the next generation. There is an inexplicable increase in deaths in Claudia's family, too. Among them is her 6-year-old daughter, Bethany.
When she was 3, she got sick, and I took her to about 5 doctors who kept telling me nothing was wrong, and I knew something was wrong. And my mother and I took her to Salt Lake, and I said, something is wrong with my child, and nobody will listen to me. And they admitted her in the hospital that night and said they'd do some tests. And then I heard a nurse say something about possible neuroblastoma. So I go down to the hospital library, and I'm digging through all this stuff, and everything I read said fatal, fatal, fatal. We don't have cancer anywhere in our family. My mother was the oldest of 11 children. I don't have an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, still don't, that has had cancer. And my sister had died, my dad had died from a brain tumor, and now my daughter was dying. Hematologist came in and he said, it's fallout. This is related from what you were exposed to.
All the therapies carried out on Bethany failed.
are the 5 largest nuclear tests that were ever caught on camera. More than a few decades ago, the first large-scale test of a thermonuclear device took place. The code name given was Ivy Mike, and it produced a blast of 10.4 megatons of TNT. Due to the size of the device, it was known beforehand that it would never be suitable for use as a deliverable weapon. Instead, it was considered a conservation project, basically meaning that it was a proof-of-concept experiment. On October 31st, 1952, the United States tested the bomb on the island of Eluge Lab. Images show that the device itself resembled that of a factory more than a nuclear weapon. The building itself was made of aluminum and given the nickname Shot Cab. After months of planning, a brief countdown commenced and Ivy Mike was detonated. In total, 9,350 members of the military and 2,300 civilians were involved in this one test. Work was finally completed on October 30th at 5 p.m., and within an hour, everybody involved was evacuated to a safe distance. The mushroom cloud created rose to a height of 56,000 feet in less than 90 seconds. A minute later, and it had reached over 108,000 feet. The blast was so powerful, it completely erased the island on which it occurred from the map, as before and after pictures show. But this was only the beginning for the United States. And, as you're about to see, many larger tests occurred in the coming years. Now, if we talk about the biggest nuclear tests, we cannot fail to mention Operation Castle. Operation Castle was a series of high-powered military nuclear tests conducted by the United States Joint Task Force 7 on Bikini Atoll, an uninhabited atoll of about 6 square kilometers that is part of the Marshall Islands. It is a very famous site on the planet because of the immense amount of nuclear testing that took place there. In fact, it is estimated that between 1946 and 1958, more than 20 atomic and hydrogen bombs were tested in the territory. And the incredible TX-17 launched in the Castle Romeo test was among them. On March 27, 1954, TX-17 became the first air-dropped thermonuclear weapon to be tested. Due to its destructive capacity of 11 megatons, the explosion of the bomb was overwhelming and resulted in a large red light illuminating the entire sky. The test was considered to be a great success and led to further tests in the area, including the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated by the United States. But first, we must show you the second largest, a test codenamed Castle Yankee. On May 5, 1954, the United States tested yet another nuclear device at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. This one was named Castle Yankee, and it released energy equivalent to 13.5 megatons of TNT, making it the second largest nuclear test done by the United States. The estimated yield from this device was roughly 9.5 kilotons, so it was surprising to many when this number was far exceeded. 2 minutes after detonation, the mushroom cloud rose to a height of 40,000 feet, equivalent to 32 Empire State Buildings. Roughly 4 days after this test, fallout reached Mexico City, some 7,100 miles away. There were some technical difficulties during the tests, but officials largely considered them a success. However, the tests performed at Bikini Atoll also altered public perception about the safety of nuclear tests once they'd become aware of the long-term side effects of fallout.
I caught my stepson spying on me in the shower. At the same time that my husband used this trick to get hard, I discovered
There is one nuclear device in the history of the United States that stands out above the rest. It was the largest ever detonated by the country, and one that surprised even the experts. The code name of the bomb was the Shrimp, but many of us know it by its operation name, Castle Bravo. Much like the other Castle tests, this one occurred at Bikini Atoll, and on March 1st, 1954, the Castle Bravo test commenced. It was noteworthy for being the first lithium deuteride-fueled thermonuclear weapon tested by the country. Scientists expected the bomb to produce an explosion of 6 megatons. However, due to unforeseen reactions from the use of lithium-7, the blast was measured more than double that size, coming in at 15 megatons. As a result of the greater-than-expected yield, radiological contamination spread to nearby islands, affecting U.S. soldiers and inhabitants living in the region, along with a Japanese fishing boat. It took 3 days to evacuate citizens, but by then, it was too late. Hundreds suffered from radiation sickness. The blast led to an international incident over thermonuclear testing, with traces from this event found in places like India and Australia. A few years later, in 1963, a partial nuclear test ban treaty was signed to hopefully limit incidents like these from happening ever again. Operation Hardtack 1 was a series of 35 nuclear tests conducted by the United States that included more nuclear detonations than the sum of all previous nuclear explosions in the Pacific Ocean. This operation, led by Joint Task Force 7, involved approximately 19,100 personnel, including members of the U.S. military, civilian employees, affiliates of the Department of Defense, and the Atomic Energy Commission. The tests, which took place between April 28th and August 18th, 1958, became some of the most fascinating nuclear tests ever recorded on camera. On May 16th, a test known as Wahoo took place. While it's not on this list for being one of the biggest, we included it because it gives you a new and high-definition look at the scale of a nuclear blast, and because it's one that occurred underwater. Within 7 seconds of detonation, the dome spray had reached a height of over 800 feet. A target ship stationed about 3.5 miles away was directly hit by the shockwave, which shook it violently. The test was considered a success and paved the way for further underwater tests to take place in the following months. And now, let's have a look at the largest nuclear device ever detonated in the history of the world, the Tsar Bomba. On October 30th, 1961, the Soviet Union tested the largest nuclear device ever created. To this day, no other country has come close to topping it. The Soviet RDS-220 hydrogen bomb, also known as the Tsar Bomba, was detonated above the Sukhoinos Cape of Severny Island, a little over 9 miles away from Mityushika Bay. Although the detonation was planned in secret, United States intelligence was able to detect the blast given its size. It is said that the bomb produced a yield of roughly 58 megatons of TNT. To put that into perspective, that's almost 3,000 times the strength of the device used on Hiroshima in World War II. According to reports, the detonation was large enough to break windows located 560 miles away, and the flash of light was visible up to 620 miles away. A blast of this magnitude would be capable of creating a fireball roughly 6.3 square miles in size, and any living creatures within 4,080 square miles of the epicenter would likely suffer third-degree burns. In recent years, Russia has declassified never-before-seen footage of the blast, showing us the full power of the Tsar Bomba.
Осталось 3 секунды. 2, 1, 0. Взрыв сопровождался световой вспышкой необычной силы. В этот момент самолет-носитель находился в 45 километрах от места сброса. Вспышка и последующее свечение, несмотря на сплошную облачность, были видны в радиусе до 1000 километров. Через несколько секунд после взрыва диаметр пылевого столба составлял около 10 километров.
Thankfully, the Tsar Bomba was never designed with the intention of being used in battle. The goal was simply to demonstrate the nuclear power of the Soviet Union as a deterrent to its enemies at the time. Believe it or not, the plans to build large-scale nuclear weapons did not stop here. Originally, there were plans to build an even larger version of the Tsar Bomba, one that would produce a yield of nearly 100 megatons. The problem was that the delivery aircraft, no matter how fast, would not have been able to outrun the blast. So, plans were scrapped.
This missile, called Sarmat, or Satan II, is the most advanced nuclear missile in the world. Its warheads are impossible to intercept. The fact is that this is the first missile in the world that can strike the territory of a probable enemy through the South Pole. For NATO and Canada, this was an unpleasant surprise. The main missile defense force, the NORAD system, is designed to intercept missiles that are launched through the North Pole. On the southern side, the U.S. has no warning systems or missile defense systems. Therefore, U.S. satellites can detect a Sarmat launch, calculate its trajectory, but will not be able to defend themselves. Some of the missiles are based at a missile range in the Kaluga region. These are the so-called nuclear glades. According to the tests conducted, the time of approach of the missile to London will be about 8 minutes, to New York, about 20 minutes. The range of firing Sarmat is 18,000 kilometers, or more than 11,000 miles. This is enough to fly around the planet 1.5 times. The maximum speed in the atmosphere is 17,982 kilometers per hour, or more than 11,000 miles. The exact number of warheads is classified, but there is information that the missile can carry on board up to 15 warheads with a power of 750 KT each. If that many landed on New York, it would look like this. In addition to warheads, a substantial weight limit would be set aside for traditional missile defense, overcoming systems such as decoys. These are decoys that look like warheads but carry no nuclear charge. They are needed to fool the missile defense system. The missile is able to overcome the missile defense system by giving the engines almost as much power as is needed to put the warheads into a circular orbit. The missile can attack the territory of the enemy country not by the shortest, but by any direction, including through the South Pole, bypassing the deployed missile defenses designed for the trajectories of conventional ICBMs launched from Eurasia through the North Pole, which would require the enemy country to costly deploy not fragmentary, but circular missile defense.
What would happen if someone deliberately tried to blow up a nuclear power station? How bad would this be in a modern power plant? Would we see the nuclear fallout similar to Chernobyl? Or would it be a lot worse? Some reports are saying that it could be 10 times worse than Chernobyl, while others disagree and state the opposite. So, let's discuss it. The threat of bad actors trying to blow up a nuclear power station has been thought about in the design of the power plants. But with a full war raging across Europe, there is a real threat that either deliberately or by accident that a nuclear power plant will be hit and go into a critical meltdown. At the time of recording, the Russian forces occupy Europe's biggest nuclear power plant and have engaged in warfare both at this plant as well as in Chernobyl. This gives two different threats: attacking a live power plant and attacking a previous radiation source or storage. Before we talk about what might happen if these places were attacked, let's discuss the two major nuclear power disasters in the past, Chernobyl and Fukushima, and how and why they exploded. On the 26th of April 1986, a safety stress test on the fourth reactor of the Chernobyl power plant went horribly wrong. The operation of a nuclear reactor is all about controlling the cascade of neutrons that is being emitted and absorbed. In nuclear fission, the energy is generated by having atoms decay from one nuclear species to another with a lower atomic number. In this process, the binding energy of the atoms is released, which can generate a massive amount of energy. Also in this process, neutrons are often emitted, which is a key for sustaining a nuclear reaction. Basically, we add an isotope of a radioactive atom, say uranium, that has a relatively long lifetime. But if that isotope was to absorb an additional neutron, then its lifetime would become extremely short, forcing the atom to decay. If all of the neutrons that are emitted from one decaying atom are absorbed by other atoms, which then decay and emit more neutrons, there would be a critical reaction, where very quickly all of the atoms that decay release enough energy to form a massive explosion. This is the exact principle behind nuclear weapons, although they use atoms that are more prone to an out-of-control reaction. So to control the reaction in a nuclear power plant, there needs to be material added to help to absorb the neutrons, which can slow down and even stop the nuclear reactions. But at the same time, there needs to be a material that does the opposite, that can be interchanged so that the reaction can be controlled, and thus the amount of energy generated is controlled. In many reactors, water is used to absorb neutrons and carry the heat away from the reactor, which eventually turns turbines and generates electricity. But this is not enough, so reactors use additional control rods to control the reaction. Chernobyl had control rods that had a section of graphite at the bottom, which enhanced the reaction, and a section of boron carbide at the top, which absorbs almost all of the neutrons, stopping the reaction. But due to a design flaw, this ended up causing a catastrophic failure. Now, there are a few reasons why Chernobyl exploded, but I will briefly explain. During a safety test, they had most of the rods that allow them to control the reactor removed, placing the reactor in a slower reaction, but not completely shut off. That is, there was no graphite in between to enhance the reactions, but nor was there boron carbide to stop it. Instead, water was in the void. Water is a good neutron absorber, so it does slow down the reaction, but this made the reactor very sensitive to the conditions of the water. The water began to boil, creating voids where there was no water to absorb neutrons anymore. And this accelerated the nuclear reaction and was the beginning of the end. As this started to get out of hand, the engineers decided to insert the control rods again to stop the reaction. And this is where the design flaw comes into play. Because the graphite was at the bottom, as they inserted the control rod, the graphite is placed next to the reactor first. And this caused an already beginning to run away a nuclear reaction to go completely critical, vaporizing the cooling water and ultimately resulting in multiple explosions. In the end, the question of what the explosions were is still up for debate. The first explosion is assumed to be water pipes exploding from the pressure. But the second has been theorized that it could have been the separation of water into hydrogen and oxygen, which when it recombined, exploded. Or it could have been a full-blown nuclear explosion. Either way, the aftermath of this incident was terrible. While the explosions themselves were bad, the real damage to the surrounding area was from the fire that ensued. The graphite from the reactor burnt, taking with it a lot of radioactive material, spreading it across Europe in the winds. Approximately 30 people died from the immediate blast trauma or the radiation poisoning in the seconds to months after the disaster, with 60 people in total in the decades since. In total, the number of deaths related to the event in Europe has various estimates, ranging from 4,000 to 16,000. In Belarus, the closest country to Chernobyl, which is inside the Ukraine, 1/3 of the milk and 1/5 of the meat was too contaminated to use in 1987. At the same time, in Ukraine, between 30 to 90% of milk in the clean areas was judged too contaminated to drink. So could this happen in a modern nuclear reactor? Not really. Newer reactors have fixed this design flaw and even built significantly better safety procedures. Even if a missile was to hit one of these reactors, this would not likely occur and is not the greatest concern. There is something that is much more dangerous, and this is where we need to talk about the Fukushima nuclear disaster. This is a story of how a series of unfortunate events led to the second worst nuclear power plant failure of all time. On the 11th of May 2011, one of the worst earthquakes to ever hit Japan, with a magnitude of 7.4, resulted in the nuclear power station of Fukushima losing power. In this event, the nuclear reactor cores shut down and diesel generators start to continue to flow water through the reactor to keep it cold. Unfortunately, the biggest tsunami to hit Japan in hundreds of years struck the plant shortly after. The wave had a height of around 14 meters and was moving at more than 150 kilometers per hour. This overcame the tsunami protection of the plant, destroying most of the diesel generators and massively damaging the facility. This resulted in the cores getting hotter and hotter, building up so much pressure that even if they had the power to do so, they could no longer push water into the cores to cool them down. As a result, they had to send a group of people on what was potentially a suicide mission into the reactors to manually vent the pressure into the atmosphere. While this did release radiation, it was better than allowing the reactors to explode. This gave the workers enough time to work on cooling down the reactors. They were able to do this with a combination of helicopters and firefighters to get enough water into the reactors and cool them down and stop a more serious event. But it was almost catastrophic. At one point, the pools where the spent fuel rods were being stored began to empty. If these pools were emptied, a fire would start that would spread radioactive material everywhere, with the potential of it being 10 times worse than Chernobyl. Luckily, there have been no recorded deaths from this incident, but there are likely to be some in the future from the cancer that some of the first responders form. Now let's discuss what would happen if military action destroyed one of these power plants. Let's start with what might happen if Chernobyl took more critical damage. Chernobyl no longer contains any active power plants, with the last being shut down in December 2000. But there is still the contaminated remains of the disaster. The real risk here is that a targeted attack on the remains would destroy the capping layer and start a new fire. This would not be as bad as the original disaster. The radioactive materials had decades of time to decay, but it would still spew radioactive clouds into the air, potentially contaminating vast regions of Europe with radioactivity. A far more pressing concern is what is happening in a live nuclear power station in the south of the country. The Zaporizhzhia power plant has 6 active reactors and is currently under Russian control, although this might change at any time. The problem is that there has been fighting in the facility itself, and the chances of something happening, like a rogue missile hitting something, is a real threat. Now, if a missile did hit one of these reactors, then it is possible that we could see a similar situation to Fukushima, except we would be working against the clock to cool down and stabilize a facility in an active war zone. This being said, the facility is far better constructed than the Fukushima plant, and it has been tested for the possibility of missile strikes, and after 9/11 it has been tested for the scenario of planes crashing into it, and the facility has been built to withstand these events. While a direct strike is a concerning situation, there is something that is far more concerning. A potentially more serious hazard could come if the power supply to the nuclear reactors and the backup generators was lost and led to a loss of coolant. With no electricity to power the pumps around a hot reactor, the fuel would start to melt down. You can think of this as the same issue as Fukushima, but all that needs to happen is a loss of power. Ukraine's nuclear agency says 3 out of the 4 transmission lines linking the plant to the Ukraine have already been damaged by rocket fire. If this last source of power was also broken, the agency believes that the nuclear fuel would begin melting down, resulting in a release of radioactive substances into the environment, and the diesel generators would not provide a long-term solution. Additionally, there is the issue of the spent fuel pools, which in theory should be safe, but if the pools were to drain, this would present a significant issue. And again, this is what people refer to when they say things could be 10 times worse than Chernobyl. One expert had this to say: the weapons being used to fight around the Zaporizhzhia facility didn't appear to be sufficient to harm the spent fuel pools. If they were to drain though, this would result in a meltdown of the radioactive material containing them, causing an expulsion of large amounts of radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. This is such a delicate situation. This is the first time in history that we have had a nuclear power station that has been in this situation. One bad decision, one rogue missile, one bad person. That is all it could take to start the worst nuclear power disaster ever.
You're enjoying a night of relaxation, catching up on the infographic show videos you missed during your busy work week. Suddenly, the screen goes black, the lights go out, and the air conditioner turns off. What's going on, you say into the darkness? You stumble to the window and look outside. There are no lights coming from any of the houses in your neighborhood. The glow of the nearby city has been extinguished. The electricity has gone out around the world. In the next 60 minutes, there will be chaos, panic, and death. According to a former director of the CIA, Robert James Woolsey, 90% of humans could die in the United States if the electricity were to completely go out. This is a staggering statistic, which puts the death toll at around 297 million people in the U.S. alone. So, what would happen in the first 60 minutes of all electricity going out that could lead to such a terrible catastrophe? Let's find out. The power goes out. There are two sides to this scenario. Half of the world would be in daytime and the other half would be in night when the electricity goes out. The moment this disastrous event happens, the Earth goes silent. There's no more humming of light bulbs or buzzing of radiators. No one knows that the world is about to fall apart. There is another nuclear threat looming on the horizon. Nuclear power plants have a number of fail-safes and redundancy systems in place to prevent meltdowns. Humans have learned from the past that a natural disaster near a nuclear power plant can lead to catastrophe, even in the most state-of-the-art facilities. But no one could predict that all electricity on the entire planet would go out all at once. Nuclear reactors are now quickly heating up to critical levels. Electricity is needed to circulate water through the system to keep the fuel elements that emit radiation cool. Without the pumps functioning properly, the reactor can't maintain a temperature within safe limits. Nuclear facilities across the globe are evacuated, as there is now nothing to stop the chain reaction happening at their cores.
Okay, well, I really hope that that hit you the way it hit me the first time I saw all those videos. Anyways, until next time, I wish you well, God bless you, and I hope you tune in to the next one.